Welcome to the Unseminary Podcast. Are you looking for practical ministry help to drive your ministry further, faster? Have a sinking feeling that your ministry training didn't prepare you for the real world? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others in pursuit of stuff that we wish they had taught in seminary. Buckle up and let's get started with this week's Unseminary Podcast.
All right, well, welcome to the Unseminary Podcast. My name's Rich, the host around these parts. Thanks so much for tuning in today, for giving us a slice of your time. I know as a pastor, you're super busy. You got a lot going on in your world, so I just really value the fact that you take some time to listen in on this conversation today, and you're not going to be disappointed. I have been really looking forward to this conversation for a few weeks now. We've got William Vanderbloemen on the phone. Super excited to have him. If you don't know William, I hope by the end of this call, you'll want to get to know him a little bit more and everything his organization does. So William, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rich. It's an honor to be here. Really glad to see what you're doing with Unseminary. I think it's a need that's going to be filled. I've got a kid who, our oldest, is a rising junior in college. He wants to go into ministry, and I'm like, well, the last thing you need to do is go the traditional hybrid hour. So he's probably listening today and will be for a while. I think it's an awesome idea and really glad to see it working.
So great. I really appreciate that. Thanks so much for the encouragement there, William. Well, for people that don't know you, why don't you kind of introduce yourself, give us a sense of who you are.
Sure. So I tell people I'm a recovering pastor, which means that this is probably going to be a little long-winded, but you told me four hours, right?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, until the computer runs out. Yeah.
Right. So, I pastored churches for about 15 years and was in the main line in the Presbyterian Church. That's just where I grew up. I was in a pretty evangelical, sort of kingdom advancing church and just went into what I grew up in. Didn't know any better, had never heard of anything like the Willow Creeks or Liquid churches or anything in the world. And really was kind of, I think, probably a little bit of a misfit. If you looked at my contact list or friend list while I was pastoring, if you were nice, you would say he has a diverse set of friends. And if you were not nice, you'd say he's schizophrenic.
Nice.
Just developed this really crazy network of friends. Left ministry in the wake of a divorce, which is not something I'd recommend, but you don't always get to choose everything in life. And went into the corporate world. Worked for a Fortune 200 oil and gas company and helped them with succession planning, talent retention. They were all great men that were leading the company. I made great money, and it was the first year I'd ever maxed out my vacation time. I didn't know what hump day was till I went into that job. It was just awful. So long story short, God brought those two streams of experience together, and I got to train under an executive search consultant that had been at Russell Reynolds, which is sort of one of the best ones in the world. And with the crazy idea of trying to build an executive search practice for churches. And the guy that taught me said, you're going to try and help churches find staff, and then they're going to pay you based on what they pay their people. I said, yeah. He said, you're going to be like broke, right? and I said, well, let's give it a try, because I just love pastors. I love churches. And gosh, that seems like a lifetime ago when we started. And now we're working all over the world, internationally, mostly in the U.S., and with churches big and small. And now I do know why God put that diverse or schizo network together. It's kind of all been leading up to this chapter of life. So it's just a lot of fun, very humbling to get to help connect a church to their next pastor or key pastoral staff member.
Right. I think I didn't know. I forgot about the Presbyterian deal. That connects with my story. I was actually in a Presbyterian church that God got a hold of my life and our family's life. It just totally turned us upside down. We ended up at this church, and the guy at the church talked like he actually believed the Bible was true, which I remember I was an 8th grade kid. And I'm like, wow, this is different. Like, I think that guy actually believes that stuff, which was, which is the same kind of thing. Evangelical Presbyterian Church. It was had huge influence on us. So and owe a lot to those years for sure. Well, William, you sit in a really unique place in the kingdom. You have kind kind of insight into a lot of different churches across a bunch of different streams. I am intrigued when I see, I follow you and your organization on Twitter and get your emails. And whenever I, just kind of dip in and see all the different streams, the kinds of churches that are coming to you, it really is a wide spectrum, all different kinds of organizations, which I think is great. But what would you say when you look kind of to the next 15 years, would you say is kind of a big issue on the horizon that as church leaders we need to be thinking about?
Yeah, well, I've got a book coming out right now, and if anyone out there has written a book before, I am the guy that just has a hammer, so everything looks like a nail. Right?
Right.
So we wrote a book on pastoral transitions, and really we set out to write it. I wrote it. The co-author is Warren Bird, who's a researcher for Leadership Network. Yep. And is a researcher extraordinaire.
Yeah, Warren's been on the show. He's a fantastic guy.
Great guy. And we studied about 500 churches. Wow. We did close to 200 in-person interviews with succession stories. And we started by thinking, what's going to happen when Rick and Bill retire? When Saddleback and Willow have to face paying the light bill without having the founders. Right. And I'm not, those are both great guys and have been mentors to me, so not anything critical in saying that, but
I get that.
They are sort of the pioneers of an era, and that era's got a lot of guys that are getting a little bit older, and so it's like, what happens next? 15 years from now, the average age for the senior pastor of a megachurch is 51 years old. So 15 years from now, it's not 51 anymore, unless they're not mega churches. So we really started to ask the question, what are the common denominators in successions that have gone well? What are the common denominators in ones that haven't gone well? We talked to everybody. We talked to the Schuler family from Crystal Cathedral. They're bankrupt now and gone. Yep. We talked to everyone who did not work out at First Baptist Dallas after Dr. Criswell retired. We've talked to the Stockstills in Baton Rouge, who have now done father to son 3 times, and it's worked well. So we really found some cool things happening. But one thing we realized was pastors on average spend about 18 years serving churches in their ministry. And they have an average stay at their church of 8 years, just across all senior pastor or head pastor, solo pastor, not student pastor, children pastor, such. So, on average, a pastor is going to transition at least twice during their career. Right. So it's really not just about how do I prepare for when the guy who started the church and has been here forever leaves. It's a book that we hope will prepare everybody. And the big idea behind the book was something that dawned on me one day. I was talking to a pastor, and he said, well, I'm ready for a change. And I was like, what do you want to do? And he said, man, I'll do youth ministry. I'll do children's ministry. I'll do anything except one thing. What's that? He said, I will not be an interim pastor, the kind of intentional interim. And it just kind of came out of me. I said, you know what? Every pastor is an interim pastor.
Wow, that's true.
It's like, unless you close the doors of your church, right?
Unless you're the church planner, it grows up and then you close it.
You can shut it down. Jesus could return. That's another option, right? But beyond those two, someone's coming after you.
Yeah,
so,
definitely.
I think it's more than you wanted to hear, but it's
really absolutely
cool to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great principle. I remember in my very first pastorate with the, one of the things that my senior pastor said, I remember it was one of those things that resonated. He said, you know what? This church belongs to the people that we're serving before we got here, and it belongs to them after we leave. And so our job is to steward it, which I was like, yeah, that's an interesting thought. But I think the idea there of stewarding this, we have a time, a generation that our job is to hold it well, even if that's a long time, but we're going to pass it on. Now, were there a few kind of nuggets? Now, obviously, ultimately we want people to buy the book, so don't give away everything. And you obviously can't in a few-minute interview. But what were those few things that kind of maybe first on the person transitioning, the kind of individual transitioning? What were some of those things that you learned through this process?
Sure. Well, and I don't know if you want to send this out to your readers, but I can send you a link to one of the chapters of the book. That,
perfect.
Frankly, I think is the best chapter in the book. It's
right.
the 10 Commandments of Succession Planning.
Okay, cool.
And,
yeah.
One thing we found out is there is no cookie cutter. So if you're talking to a consultant or a denominational leader or whoever that says, well, here are the 7 steps to success. Well, it's just not that way, because you're dealing with people, and people are living, changing organisms, and you're dealing with a body of people in the church and a pastor. So there is no one thing. We did learn a few things that came out kind of as cardinal rules. One is the earlier you start planning, the better. In the corporate world, we found that there's a lot of public trading regulations. Sarbanes-Oxley is an act that went through, and a lot of companies have said, okay, it is now a requirement that we have a successuen plan, for public trust.
Yep.
And several companies we studied, had, when the new CEO arrives and has his first board meeting, the first agenda item is the succession plan.
Wow.
Like, welcome to town. What are we going to do when you're gone? So it's not exactly the old church pounding that we used to get, and the pastor arrived to town and everybody filled the house with goods. But a church that's willing to have that conversation early is a smart church. They're rare, but they're out there. A couple of nuggets that we found that prevent good successions is that one is just money. Okay. And that's on both sides of the equation, that churches don't pay pastors enough and pastors don't manage their funds well. And so, we feel like we put some good pointers in the book about how a church board can provide financial planning for the pastor, how they can make sure they're paying the right amount. Because, they're trying to steward the offerings out of the widow's cupboard. Yeah. At the same time, you got to pay them well enough that they can retire. Right. And then the other thing that we found was really smart churches, somewhere around 50 or 55, more like 55 for most pastors, there tends to be a common theme that they develop sort of an avocation or an area of passion. Maybe it's a mission cause abroad somewhere that they've been working with for a while, or a children's home, or teaching at a seminary or something like that. Lots of churches' normal response is, you don't need to do that. We need to have all your attention. Smart churches let that grow and create more and more time for it, so that when it's time to transition, they've got somewhere to go. Right. They've got an identity, because there's no profession I know that consumes your identity like the pastorate. Yeah, it's where you do social networking. It's where you have friendships. It's where you do your spiritual life. It's all in, right? Right. And a loss of identity is a big problem for guys that leave, and it tends to be why they come back and micromanage. But the real secret that we probably could have gotten in a lot of trouble if we'd have written more about. And so no tweeting this, right? But really smart churches take great care of the outgoing pastor's spouse.
Oh, that's great.
I could tell you horror stories of successions, and there's a direct line from all the wreckage back to the outgoing pastor's spouse. Yeah. Either wasn't treated well, or didn't feel right, or
wasn't honored. They didn't do anything on the way out, or I can identify with that. I know in my life I've joked that the voice of the Lord sounds very similar to the voice of my wife. There's a strong correlation between those two. And I think that's true. I can see that, for sure.
Right. And, First Baptist Dallas had Dr. Criswell forever, nearly 50 years, some crazy number like that. Before him was Dr. Truett, Truett Seminary, right? And he was there about the same amount of time. So,
Two pastors in 100 years.
Something like that. It's like 90 years. It's long, whatever it is. So I didn't know. We found some research that showed that when Dr. Criswell got there, he almost didn't make it. Like, it was pretty rocky for a while. And one of the key turning points, and you might have some people that disagree, but one of the key turning points was Miss Truitt reached out to Miss Criswell and said, let's make this work.
Really? Wow, that's fascinating. Well, you can see that, right? That just practically makes sense, right? That's like one of those, yeah, you can see that. That makes sense. What are the, a question. So, I'm in my 40s. I'm a 40 something, and I look around and my peers are a lot of the 40 something folks. And one of the things I've noticed is churches, it seems like a lot of churches that are led by people, particularly in that time frame, folks come into their 40s and like their churches are super innovative. They're doing all kinds of stuff. And then they leave their 40s and they're not doing that anymore. There's a bit more atrophy has set in. There's a bit more, whether we become less risk taking. I don't know, why that is, but what would you say to a church leader, even in their 40s, which is still a couple decades off from, that kind of transition? Are there things they could be doing to prepare even now for that kind of transition?
Boy, that is so insightful, Rich. We did a study a while back. We need to do it again with a much bigger sampling, but we asked the question, knowing God can use a man or woman whenever he chooses to, what are the normal times that he lays his hand on a pastor and says, this is the sweet spot, right?
Right.
Josiah was 8 when he was king. Abram was a bajillion when he started Israel.
Right.
But what's the norm?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we study church growth charts and pastors' ages. When you see the spike in growth, I can show you the pastor's 40th birthday. It's like predictable. It's just, it's like they're young enough, they've got fire in the belly, but they're not 25. I took a big church when I was 31, and the advantage of doing that when you're 31 is everything, right? So at 31, you think you know everything. By the time you're 40, you've gotten knocked around enough that it's a nice combination. So 40 is a great start point. So if you keep going down that study, I can show you the pastor's 55th birthday every time.
That's fascinating.
Some of them go longer. I mean, Ed Young turns 80, I think this year, maybe next, and he's still taking steps 2 at a time and killing it. Right. Steve Furtick's just over 30 and he's killing it. So there are anomalies, but there's this coast thing that happens. And I don't want to go all super spiritual, but if you look in the Bible, you tell your volunteers as a pastor all the time, retirement isn't biblical, right?
Right.
Well, it is. Retirement's mentioned one time in the Bible.
Okay.
And it was mandatory, and it was for the priests. And it was at 55, and David, they quit wandering around the wilderness. David changed it to 60. And the reason behind it was, of course, they're carrying the tabernacle, right? So, but if you think of it spiritually a bit, the weight of carrying the things of God becomes too much for a man after a certain age.
Right. That's fascinating. It's interesting because that that whole 40 thing has been something that's been resonating, and you could see that, right? At some point, like there's guys, you mentioned it, like I look at a guy like Bill Hybels, who we all stand on his shoulders in one way or another. And I'm like, I'm looking forward to the day he gets to retire, right? Because it's like, at some point you're like, do you really want to get up and preach one more sermon? Do you really want to plan another service?
And the other thing we found is, the biggest fear people have in life is public speaking, right? The old Seinfeld line,
right.
Higher than death. They'd rather be the subject of the funeral than the funeral speaker, right?
Yes.
Well, for a man to have an ability to get up and speak every week and say, God says this for your life, that's big, right?
Yeah, that's huge.
The shadow side of that is the voice that whispers in your ear saying, you got one more season.
Right.
We named it in the book, we named it Brett Favre syndrome. Right. I think what you can do to prevent that is have an honest annual conversation with your board. Set metrics. What are the things we're going to do so that when plateau hits, we've all said this is a plateau, and what are we going to do about it?
Oh, gosh, that's huge. Repeat what you just said there, because I think that's huge for all of us.
Well, I think the smart board, if you're a young pastor, and the pastor is going to have to lead the conversation, the board's not going to do it, and unless you're in like a toxic situation.
Right.
Smart pastors in their 40s will say, all right, guys, let's get together, let's set some metrics. And it might be spiritual growth, it might be baptisms, whatever the metrics are. Set those metrics now to say, when these stop growing, we know we're in that plateau where I'm at the spot where we need to either undergird the staff with some younger people, or I need to move in a different role, but let's name it ahead of time so it's not a surprise when it happens.
This is the Unseminary Podcast. Stuff you wish they taught in seminary.
Let's jump into the lightning round. This is that part of the show where we ask the similar questions to everybody who's been on the show, just to kind of get a sense of what's happening in their life. So today we're super privileged to have William Vanderbloemen from Vanderbloemen Search Group on, is it Vanderbloemen Search Group?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. On the show. And so what is one online resource that you're using these days that's helping you out in your work? YouVersion. Okay. Nice.
Absolutely. It's going to be written about 500 years from now, but
Nice.
There's more Bible reading done with that than anything ever, and I use it every single day.
Perfect. What's a book besides your book that you've read in the last 6 months that's had an impact on your thinking?
One book that we use around our office, and we use it as part of our onboarding because we try and offer a really high level of service at a cost churches can afford, but I mean like a ridiculously high level of service, is a book that was written by the management team of the Ritz-Carlton. It's called The New Gold Standard, and it just talks about how they drive quality from the top of the C-suite all the way down to the sous chef, and we found it to be really helpful for what we're trying to do.
Very cool. What's another ministry that you're looking at these days that's kind of inspiring you?
Dave Ramsey. So Dave, we went to his conference when we were first starting out our business, and his conference on how to run a business. And he's since become a mentor, friend, and actually one of our larger clients now.
Yeah, I've noticed that you guys have done some placements, some pretty high level placements for them, which is cool. If you could get 15 minutes with any leader alive in the entire world, who would you want to get that time with, and why?
Probably, this is going to sound crazy. Everybody's going to hang up and you're going to lose subscriptions, but I'm going to say Tony Robbins.
Okay, yeah. That's a good choice.
Not because I like watching Shallow Hal or anything like that. It's he is mentoring more world-class leaders than anyone else that I know. And so I would love to have 15 minutes with him just to glean. He's also got great teeth. He's got those nice. Yes, fantastic teeth.
All right. So when you're just looking to have fun, kind of kick back, you're not, you're just done placing people for the day. What do you do for fun? How do you relax? Have some fun.
Well, we have 7 kids, so we, relax and fun. We love our family, but with 7 kids, you can guess what we do for fun, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah. Nice. I used to swing a golf club a little bit, but not much anymore.
Nice. All right. So, William, if people want to get in touch with you, or your organization, how can they do that? What's the best way for them to be in touch, or to find the book? We'll put a link on the show notes. But how can they do that?
Sure. Yeah. And it's super simple. You just go to vanderbloemen.com, and I mean, on the off chance that your people don't know how to spell that, just remote.
Right.
Go to findourleader.com.
Nice.
And for the book, they can go to nextpastor.com. We went to a brand specialist when we started the firm. We bought probably 300 domain names, Find Our Pastor, all these different things.
Yep.
And they did their study and came back and said, you know what? Your last name is so screwed up, it works.
Nice. That's fun.
So, yeah.
Well, that's cool. William, I really appreciate you being on the show today. Thanks so much for taking time out and for sharing. And I encourage people to go out and grab the book and read it. And I think it really will have an impact, hopefully for years to come.
Thanks a lot, Rich. Really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's Unseminary podcast. Don't be shy. We'd love to connect. Check out Unseminary Inbox. You can sign up at unseminary.com, and we'll send you helpful training resources every week. Plus, you'll gain immediate access to our exclusive members area with tons of resources you can use. Connect with Rich on Twitter at Rich Birch or through email, rich@unseminary.com. Don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode at unseminary.com. It includes links to what we talked about today and more. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Did you enjoy today's episode? Drop by iTunes and leave a review. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's Unseminary podcast. Join us next week when we'll learn more stuff we wish they taught in seminary.